Good morning. Good morning, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Another episode of The Breakup, a show where we look at our relationship with money and contrast our relationship with the US dollar with the burgeoning and beautiful relationship of Bitcoin. So it's a slightly biased show, but really it's not about trading your dollars for Bitcoin. The point of the show is to discuss the psychology behind our relationship with each of these money, with each of these types of money. And the point is that the economics, but the economy itself is not really a fight between Austrian school and modern monetary theory. It's not about being right or wrong. It's really a psychology engine. And in the end, the psychology that perpetuates the better future will be the winner. So, what we're trying to talk about on this show is really the psychology that Bitcoin perpetuates amongst Bitcoiners like myself. So, that's why I try to sign on to every one of these episodes by saying I'm a Bitcoiner. So, at least you know where I'm coming from. But it's about a worldview and a psychology that comes from having a relationship with that money. And what I'm here for is to walk people through their relationship with the US dollar and basically underline why it's an unhealthy relationship and why you need to break up, because it really is a lot more like a breakup. So it's not about buying Bitcoin with dollars. That's not quite enough. That's when you get folks who are like, when are you going to sell your Bitcoin and cash out? And Bitcoiners who are pretty far down that road say, what are you even talking about? Sell my Bitcoin for what? Right? Because it's about psychology. It would be like changing your entire mind about something. Very difficult to do. So, but very difficult to do. And that's why I'm here, because I understand it's difficult. I could never do it from the Bitcoin side of things. But for anyone who's still hooked on dollars and thinking about the US dollar as the major psychology engine of the world, I'm here to say, well, maybe that psychology doesn't really have much momentum and propensity to build a future that is suitable for you. Today, I'm going to talk a bit more about why it's corrupted, and I'll get there. I wanted to start with this brief infograph explaining fraud, uh, because I think fraud has a few elements to it that we can judge and use as a frame to understand what's happening with the Federal Reserve. Not exactly fraud, definitely a difference, but an important distinction. So let's start today with our first news story, which is the FBI kidnapping case, the Whitmer kidnapping case. And good for BuzzFeed News. I would never normally find news from BuzzFeed very interesting, but an article came out today and they really are going at the FBI agents behind the Whitmer kidnapping that occurred, or the planned Whitmer kidnapping that had in the lead up to the 2020 US presidential election. The governor of Michigan was nearly the victim of a planned kidnapping, but it turned out, and we've seen more evidence come out, that who planned this wasn't exactly the white supremacists and others that were purported to be from the very start. It turned out that some of the FBI agents themselves might have, I'm not an expert in the case, but some of the FBI agents themselves might have organized the whole thing in order to entrap people. So that would be an example of corruption, fraud. Now, the rubric I use here is this 3-point plan. Now, opportunity in this case is usually the main factor. So if ever you see a case where the opportunity to make a profit is there and the chances, if you do some fraud, but the chances of being caught are very little, you can guarantee you're going to find some fraud there. What happened in the FBI case is this fella who ran the investigation was using success in these investigations to pump up a private business doing these types of investigations. So any victory here and win, and that publicity could be used as marketing and lead generation for private clients. Normally, this person would need to get permission from the FBI to set up a private business in the first place. It looks like that wasn't done. I don't know the whole details of the case. I'm merely using it as a topical example of showing a straight case of fraud and corruption. So there was an opportunity there. Certainly, the media had a lot of pressure to find white supremacists, and that there's definitely a pressure to stop anyone who's physically threatening an election, for sure. The rationalization part is where the media really becomes a little more responsible, because it was very easy for this person to turn the white supremacist cohorts that he's with into the real villains of the story because, of course, they're white supremacists. So no one wants to defend them. I don't want to defend them. Nobody wants to defend those people. So if you combine, in this case, two really strong levers of fraud, opportunity didn't look there was much chance of getting caught. You're doing your job as an FBI undercover agent infiltrating cells, and you have this private business on the side. It was never divulged. So it's a small example. Good for BuzzFeed for underlining it, and I look forward to the results of the case. I don't know exactly what happened, and I'm not an expert in it, but that's my general impression today. And it looks like both BuzzFeed and the court system is going to find the corruption in the FBI in this case. It's not the only example, though. Take the vaccine situation, and we hear a lot about the 55-year data delay that is now part of the deal. So none of the data and results from, I think, the Pfizer vaccine will be available for quite a while. Furthermore, there's no liability for the vaccine makers. So no liability. So in that case, is there an opportunity for fraud? Yeah, and there's no liability, right? Now, I don't think anyone out there has deliberately gone to feed Americans poison. I don't believe anyone who's been involved in these vaccines is deliberately trying to make a dangerous product, anything like that. However, instances of fraud are becoming more apparent. For example, every time we hear a new variant, you start to get suggestions for booster shots. We don't even know the results of the current variant, yet we're being, or the mortality rate of the current variant. So Omicron, we hear a lot about it in the news these days, but my prediction is you'll never hear about whether it's more or less dangerous than the vaccine because it's important to sell vaccines for this new variant as it seems to be important for every variant. Now, they might be right. I'm not interested in your medical history. I got a vaccination, so that is something I decided to do. I'm not here to talk about vaccines, good or bad. I'm merely saying that because there is this opportunity, I would predict we're going to find corruption there. I don't think it's the type of corruption that is going to lead 1 million people to jail and is going to be a huge thalidomide type smoking gun where we saw data deliberately hidden and a huge payout in the end. I think billions of dollars were paid out by the drug company that made thalidomide in the 1960s for all the parents whose kids came out with the troubles. So that's definitely happening. I can't imagine with these vaccines we're going to get anything of that level, but nevertheless, there'll be instances of corruption that I think will be proven. So my prediction is we're going to see that. I don't predict we'll see it on a huge scale, but it's definitely going to be out there. Now, there's an important distinction between fraud and corruption that I want to mention now, because we've been talking about instances. In the FBI's case, there is some corruption there with the opportunity piece. It is a state apparatus. The vaccine's less, but here's a way to understand corruption when it comes to public utilities, government, all those things. It really represents state privatization when power is not shifted to the market, but is instead shifted to bureaucrats and government officials. So let me say that again. Corruption can be seen where privatization of normal state activities is not absorbed by the market, but is instead absorbed by government officials and bureaucrats. Now, we can look at what Nancy Pelosi said yesterday. Nancy Pelosi gave a press conference related to her trading of stocks that have done very well and that she voted on certain things about COVID. And a whole bunch of congressmen had to come out and divulge and disclose their exposure to public stocks. In the end, something like 75 of the 400 and whatever congressmen have been actively trading and hold various stocks and have been holding stocks that are involved in some of the COVID response. Only 70, that kind of surprised me because the opportunity is there. It's totally legal. What they're doing, there's nothing wrong with it. But the corruption piece becomes obvious. So it's not fraud. It's not fraud. But the corruption piece becomes obvious when you think of it as state privatization of power, when the power is not shifted to the market, but is instead shifted to bureaucrats and elected officials. Now, look at what Nancy Pelosi said yesterday. Her statement was, it's a free market. Well, is it? Is it a free market in light of our definition of corruption? I think she's wrong. Think about it. If there is no actual free market around a lot of the decisions that were made to the COVID response, the COVID pandemic, when the government picks a winner to mobilize almost a militaristic response to COVID, then that has already distorted the market effects. There is no private market necessarily there competing for this work. Government officials can declare who's getting the business and declare who's winning. It becomes easy to predict which companies will do well and which companies won't do well. Sometimes there might be competitors trying to solve the same problem, and the winner will get a huge boon because they get that sweet, sweet government contract. You get the sweet, sweet government money, right? So you get the sweet government money, it's much easier. And Nancy Pelosi, when she says it's a free market, well, is that the case? If bureaucrats and government officials are actually taking active participation in the marketplace, picking winners, does it make sense for them to also be able to invest and get the upside of those? That's a case of corruption, right? That's a case of corruption. Now, that's an obvious case as far as I can tell of corruption. I find it hard to even debate it. Now, I understand it's legal, so I don't expect any of these people to go to jail. I see it almost in the reverse, in the sense that why were so many of the congressmen not availing themselves of this corruption and advancing their own financial gain? I can't quite explain why it was only 70 out of 400 and whatever, but that's neither here nor there. The opportunity was there. And of course, we can see the other factors here. There was a lot of pressure. We can all rationalize it. There's a lot of pressure for these congressmen to vote and solve the pandemic and mobilize forces against it. The rationalization is clear. They are congressmen. They are there. They're leading the war effort. If you see it that way, why shouldn't they be able to participate in the very free economy that they're trying to protect with their decisions? I'd say most congressmen, Democrat or Republican, certainly believe they're there to protect the free market. But it becomes a different story when you don't even really see that it's not a free market anymore. So for her to say that it's a free market means, I don't know, she's not a stupid person, but I don't know if she sees that the corruption has actually set into the system. Not a crime, not fraud, but certainly corruption. And I would say it's probably not obvious to her because the central bank itself becomes an analogy for this. The central bank itself is an analogy for this. Just yesterday, or 2 days ago now, we heard Jerome Powell give the interest rate update on central bank policy. We heard that inflation is certainly not transitory. We heard a bit about the tools and measures the federal government, the Federal Reserve is planning to combat inflation in the next little while. But let's take a look now at this corruption model. And remember, our matrix is things when state power is privatized, not by market forces, but by government officials and bureaucrats, we have an opportunity for corruption. And if these other scenarios are there, if there's pressure, rationalization, we can guarantee it. We don't even have to find the example, we can guarantee it. So what's going on over at the Federal Reserve? Well, what's the opportunity? The opportunity has been there for a long time. The opportunity to inflate money and hide the inflation through tapering, through the repo markets, through obscene wealth creation, but slowing down of the velocity of money of hedge funds, institutional players in the economy. Of course, they benefit from the tremendously inexpensive money being injected to the system, which they can then use to capitalize other projects and fund other money-making ventures. So the opportunity certainly there for the corruption of the dollar, and the Federal Reserve has been helping it happen because they manipulate the ends of the market so that we don't actually, and for years have hidden many of the effects of inflation. While we haven't seen inflation perhaps in the consumer price index, that is also affected by the Federal Reserve. The matrix, the calculations, what goes into measuring consumer price index has been whittled away so that it's just candy bars in the end. It's not much else in there that they're measuring. So in the end, as long as candy bars stay constant, it's easier for the Federal Reserve to say there hasn't been inflation. That's why houses haven't been included. That's why a lot of assets haven't been included in inflation until now, because they have to hide over years the effects of monetary policy, particularly on increasing the wealth of already wealthy people. So the opportunity has been there for a long time for the US dollar to be corrupted by the Federal Reserve. Now the pressure has been there every time. We had a ton of people saying in the 1980s, when it was still possible to combat inflation with interest rates, that you simply must. And that's why a lot of people do think of Reagan's second term, the 1984 term, as the real shift in generations in America, right? At the end of an era, because you've got the post war period right after kind of a boom in America, then right up until Kennedy's death in 63. So from 46 to 63, you've got sort of the makings of the best time in the last 80 years that we've had in some ways. From Kennedy to Reagan too, you've got a whole other era where we start to see the divisions and the fault lines that are so apparent to us today. But those cracks started then, the cracks that are so plain and obvious to us today. But in 1984, with Reagan's second term, monetary policy took on a whole new game. And that's when some of this opportunity became clear. The institution itself was used at the time to dramatically finance an expansion of government and involvement in all kinds of things while also reducing taxes. So it was a whole new way of interpreting national debt. Now, national debt is not the same as your debt and my debt. It's not personal debt. So they were on solid theoretical ground for the experiments they were running, but it was an experiment. And will you ever hear about exactly what kind of adjustments were made as they were experimenting? I don't think you'll ever hear that. So there was a ton of pressure. And then the rationalization becomes more and more clear as we go on. As interest rates are suppressed, as the economy booms and gets red hot, and the United States is minting millionaires regularly in the 1990s and are the only major superpower left in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, you've got a situation where the United States, as a moral imperative, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said at the time, as a moral imperative, the central bank is not going to end American good times. They were going to let them perpetuate in the 1990s. So the rationalization worked. The same rationalization was used in 2008 to cover over and gloss over the exact same problem that had been caused in the 1990s. So they did it again, right? Now the opportunity has come this time again with COVID. And that's where a lot of Bitcoiners really made their divergence with what we call the US dollar economy, because everything that happened with COVID, Bitcoiners predicted way before there was ever a virus. Bitcoiners didn't know that it was a virus that was going to cause that reaction by the Federal Reserve. The theory was almost anything could cause that reaction from the Federal Reserve because of the creek ground it was found itself on after all the time changing and corrupting the institutions, so that there was an opportunity to hide the policy effects. There was no longer a free market, the bond market, that was going to be able to work against the Federal Reserve. The bond market had been wiped out. The bond market is really what would have been the free market counterbalance to monetary policy. And once that was removed, it really was just government officials and bureaucrats that were entering the system, doing bailouts, giving them more money, injecting capital, and you had monetary policy and fiscal policy, so the Treasury, the government, and the Federal Reserve more or less working together to do some corrupt stuff, right? Do some corrupt stuff. Now, the rationalization was there. There's certainly no one who's ever going to get caught for this, right? Now, the corruption itself can't be deemed the type of corruption that I think you go to jail for. This isn't, I'm going to steal from somebody, I'm going to get that kind of. No. Usually this is for people's own good. Corruption doesn't have to be just for personal gain. Sometimes corruption can be because you're so sure you're right that your idea has to be the one manifested. Now, Bitcoiners will say that most central bank economists are detached from reality at this point. we'll see as it plays out. I tend to believe the Bitcoiners, and I'm certainly in that camp. But when we look at the amount of corruption that's in the dollar as it is, we have to start saying it's time to break up. There's no way this can be fixed. This isn't a question of realigning incentives at this point. The opportunity was used many times to lower interest rates, hike money supply, bail out banks by making sure that the repo market was very liquid, and that they were basically funding banks. That's how I read repo market, by the way, the central bank funding commercial banks. I simplify it. I could be wrong. Repo remains a complicated subject. I see it as I'll lend you money overnight and I'll buy it back tomorrow for a little more. I mean, that's what I see. So I could be wrong. So when we look at this, the US dollar has already been put through this system for many years now. Is it salvageable? I say no. I say no. That's why I've already broken up with the US dollar. And that's why these institutions don't carry very much weight with me, and why I'm here for their end, and why I make this show. So that's all I got for today, guys. I'll be back tomorrow. I do shows on the weekends too. All right. Ciao.